the experience of so many people at the TRC. I'm not going to tell you all the stories of the TRC today, but the one thing that came from it is the surprising, wonderful way in which people who have suffered hideously, who suffered enormously during the apartheid, who were tortured and wronged in so many ways, how they told stories of survival because they had one another to take care of one another. But so many said we had our belief in God.
So welcome again to another episode of Searching for Hope. Today we are joined by Professor Piet Meiring, all the way from Pretoria, South Africa. Piet was appointed by President Nelson Mandela to serve with Archbishop Desmond Tutu as one of 17 commissioners on South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and since then has traveled extensively around the world, helping countries, including Canada, shape their own reconciliation structures. Most recently, he was awarded the Chancellor's Medal by the University of Pretoria for his contribution to South Africa and embracing strong values of integrity, ethical leadership, peace, and tolerance. Piet is passionate about peace and drawing unity amidst diversity. So Piet, welcome to Searching for Hope. I really look forward to learning together with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the kind intro. If you want to be technically correct, I was not a commissioner, but a member of the TRC. That's just a footnote.
Excellent.
It's nice to be able to talk to you, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor and a privilege.
So, Piet, I think it would be valuable. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up? And what kind of makes you tick?
I'm a pastor's son. My father was a dominie, as we call him, a minister of religion. My grandfather was one. My son is one. So we are a family of pastors. I was born in Johannesburg, but I grew up in a little town south of Johannesburg called Heidelberg. I went to the University of Pretoria, where I completed my theological studies, and then off to Amsterdam for the time of my life to study at the Free University for a doctorate. And in between all the fun and all the wonderful things that a South African student can taste overseas, I did manage to finish my studies. I came back to Pretoria, and eventually I was allowed into the ministry, and I served in 2 congregations in Pretoria. I also taught for a time at the University of the North, which was at that stage a university catering mainly for black students in the north of what was then called Transvaal. But then eventually I was invited to join the faculty of theology at the University of Pretoria. And the last section of my life was a wonderful time at the University of Pretoria. It was there that Tutu got hold of me. I've told you the story, but let me repeat it. I was sitting quite innocently at my desk. It was the beginning of the academic year, and I was preparing for the students that would come a week later when my telephone rang. And I innocently picked up the telephone, and then I heard the famous voice saying to me, "Piet, are you sitting down? This is Desmond speaking." So the Archbishop Desmond Tutu told me that I was appointed on the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was dumbfounded and a bit hesitant because at that stage, nobody really knew whether the TRC would survive and whether it will be a success. And I was saying, when the Arch interrupted me and he said, "Piet, let me just remind you, I'm still the Archbishop of Cape Town, and I speak for the Lord God. And the Lord says you have to come, but you have 3 days to decide." So I packed up my stuff and I joined the TRC. The university was very kind. The principal of the university said to me immediately, "No, go. Don't worry about your position. We'll retain your position at the university. You can come back to us. Let us see this as our contribution to the TRC process," which made it easy for me. But so I joined the TRC process for a couple of years. I had the painful, exhausting, exhilarating, wonderful experience of, with all the other colleagues, trying to make sense of the past of South Africa, trying to understand what was happening and trying to forge in a way, in a certain sense, a way towards the future of South Africa. But it was a wonderful time, a very difficult time, but a time that changed my life forever.
Wow. I'm curious, even just for some context here, Pete, in those years, I mean, in the 80s, 90s, from my understanding, you were not in favor of apartheid, but you were Afrikaner. You were a part of the people group or the ethnicity or the culture that was bringing in this separation, bringing in this system of apartheid. What was it like to be both a minister in a church that at times had supported it, but yet at times there was some, I don't know about this. What was that like to be?
You put your finger on all the painful spots, but
Sorry.
It's indeed so. I was after my return from Holland, I was forever convinced that apartheid was not only unworkable, that it wouldn't survive, but that it was morally and theologically wrong, that it was sinful. And in spite of that, I was still invited to become a minister, but I was part of a group of ministers that tried from within the Dutch Reformed Church to sound a word of warning from time to time. We were not very popular for that, because we really thought that apartheid was wrong, and at synods and at regional gatherings and in our writings, we tried to protest and to challenge our church to go back to its best roots of the Bible and of our Reformed confessions, and to realize that apartheid was wrong. So, unfortunately, in this process, we had many friends and many colleagues from other churches who encouraged us, and one of them was Desmond Tutu. He was very, very helpful to us when we were despondent as a group of Dutch Reformed Church ministers, because we had the wind in front of us from the front, and we had a hard time, but he was always there as a sort of a mentor. So that's the reason, I think, why I was invited on the TRC, because he knew me and he knew that where I stood. But also, Mr. Mandela stood upon the fact that a senior leader of the Dutch Reformed Church, the NG Kerk as it was called, had to be a part of the TRC, because he wanted the commission to reflect all sections of society, the different cultural and racial groups, political groups, but also the different denominations. There were one of the members from the Muslim community and the Hindu and the Jewish community, and then also from the different Christian denominations. And he wanted a man from the Dutch Reformed Church, and Tutu knew me, and he said, no, we can get this guy. But it was difficult. In my own church circle, I was accepted as somebody who voiced apartheid, my opposition against apartheid. But in the TRC, most of the people didn't know me. Many of the members of the TRC were people, expatriates who just came back from exile. Now, what would they know about a white Afrikaans dominee? So the first week or two, I was quite embarrassed, especially when I started to hear the stories, where they came from, and the experiences they had, and the little difficulty that I and my mates had were a speck in comparison with what they had to suffer for so many years. But the wonderful thing is that it took about 2-3 days when my colleagues at the Johannesburg office, where I spent most of my time, said to me, no, Piet, it's okay. We know where you come from and we accept you. And you are part of the team. And the wonderful thing is that my real blood brother, who had his office just next to my office, was quite a serious activist who was incarcerated at Robben Island for many years, Tom Mantata. And the two of us became not only friends, but brothers. So much so that Tutu from time to time sent the two of us, because he thought it was symbolic that a black ex-Roman Catholic priest who turned an activist and a Dutch Reformed Church dominee, black and white, should go together and do things. So that made it a bit easier. I remember Joyce Soroke, a wonderful woman who was in the trade union movement. She just embraced me one day at the start of the TRC and said, "Piet, relax, it's okay. You're part of the family." So they made it easy on me.
I mean, so part of what we're doing is, we're trying to find out how have people found hope through seasons where things have felt uncertain, scary, hard.
Yes.
In some ways, it sounds like those were moments probably where the light of hope was shining great, in that embrace of a hug, or as you worked with your colleague and became brothers. And I'm curious, where did you find hope in some of the challenging, like in the seasons when the power of the Afrikaner and apartheid was maybe at its height, and you maybe didn't know, when was this going to end? When are we going to get out of this? Where did you experience hope, or where did that hope really start? Was it with Mandela? Was it? Yeah, I'm curious.
Let me answer in a roundabout way.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking of it now. At one of our meetings with the Archbishop, a group of us ministers who were quite discouraged about the opposition that we had to face, invited the Arch to come and speak to us. He was just on his way back from Sweden, where he was at the funeral of Olof Palme. You remember, the Prime Minister that was murdered, assassinated. But Tutu left his luggage at the airport, and he came to Pretoria to sit with us and have a cup of coffee with us and discuss things. I remember at one stage I said to him, but we call him Uncle Desmond. If you were a Dutch Reformed Church minister, what would you tell them? That was in the 1980s. It was the time of the emergency in South Africa, when things were very hard to everybody in the community. And I said to him, if you were a Dutch Reformed Church dominee and you had to preach on a Sunday, what would you say to the congregation? And he laughed and he said, well, the Lord in his wisdom decided that I should not be a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. Can you think what would happen if that was the case? But then he said, I'll do three things. Firstly, I'll speak about personal faith. I will say to people in a serious time as this, you need to know where you stand with the Lord God. There's no time not to be sure. So go to your congregants and challenge them, ask them, how is your personal faith? Do you really believe that you are saved by Jesus Christ? Are you in a personal relationship with God? That is point one. The second point is, I'll speak about hope. He said, I can well imagine that white Afrikaners are on tender hooks, that they read the lessons of history. They see that things are changing and things won't be the same. And they must be very, very hesitant, not knowing what the future will hold for them. Go preach hope. Tell them that it's not men and women who decide what's happening in history. God is on the throne, and Jesus Christ has the reins of history in his hands. Go and tell your people, do not be despondent, do not despair. Jesus is in command. You have every reason to hope. And then thirdly, he said, and now please let go of apartheid. That's where all the problems started. But I thought, if you ask me what should our message be in South Africa today, I think it's along the same lines. Firstly, the time is too serious not to be serious about your faith. And we try to do that while we are ministering in this strange new way to people not going to church, but using emails and some church services that are taped and sent to people. But I think the first thing we must say over and over to them, maybe this is a time of grace, because it challenges us to make sure where we stand with God. The second thing is to instill a sense of hope, to say to them, but look, it is not in the final sense that the politicians who decide. It's not the coronavirus that decide what's going to happen. Our lives, the history of the world, is really in God's hands. So take courage. Go on. We We do not believe in events. We do not believe in people, in leaders. We believe in the person of Jesus Christ. And that gives one hope. And then thirdly, Tutu said, let's let go of apartheid. I think in our country, we only now during the lockdown, not only now, but especially now, during this time of lockdown, see how huge the gaps in our society is, even after a quarter of a century after apartheid. The abject poverty of so many people, the despair of people. There's so much injustice still in society. And I think if we need to do one thing is we must really try and grapple with all the unsolved problems of South Africa, of injustice and corruption and all the other stuff. Sorry, that was a whole sermon, but you asked me to say what we would say.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
The interesting thing is during the TRC time, how not only Tutu, as you know, often called upon his Christian faith to sustain him and to sustain us, but how the other commissioners and the other people working for the TRC from time to time, in a very surprising way, started to talk about their faith. I was talking about Tom Mantata. Tom he's a Roman Catholic. He joined the seminary. He wanted to be trained as a priest. But after 6 months, half a year, he was thrown out of the seminary, because they said he's not a priest, he's an activist. And he was an activist. He joined the ANC and he was in and out of the country. And eventually he was caught, he was thrown in jail. He spent some time, years, at Robben Island in prison. And eventually when he was released, he became part of the struggle in Soweto, and when Soweto became ungovernable, the people in Soweto elected their own committee of 10 to take charge, and he was one of them. So he was a strong leader. But he said to me, when I was in prison, when I was in jail, what sustained me was my faith. He said, what sustained me was the Bible that they had to give me according to law. Every prisoner should have a Bible. And he said, I read the Bible, I read the Psalms, and they sustained me. And then he said to me a very interesting thing. He said, when I was in solitary confinement, not having Bible, nothing, I sustained myself. I kept sane by repeating to myself the liturgy of the Mass in the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, he knew it by heart, and he led himself in the Sunday services. And he said his personal faith, that kept him alive. And that was also the experience of so many people at the TRC. I'm not going to tell you all the stories of the TRC today, but the one thing that came from it is the surprising, wonderful way in which people who have suffered hideously, who suffered enormously during the apartheid, who were tortured and wronged in so many ways, how they told stories of survival because they had one another to take care of one another. But so many said we had our belief in God, and we knew in the end justice will prevail because we believe in a living God. And I think maybe that's a lesson for us. In trying times such as this, we really need one another. We are socially should not be too close to one another, a 1.5 meter distance. Same as I presume in Canada. We shouldn't go out of our houses, but we can talk to one another on the telephone, and in so many ways we're going to reach out to one another. And I think we will, in a sense, of course we will survive, because we are a family of human beings, of Christians. But that is in the second place. The first place is we will survive because we really believe that God is in command, that our personal faith keep us and keep the fire burning.
Piet, I'm curious. We'll bounce back and forth a little bit. I'm very curious. I've never heard this story, I don't think, but I'm curious what it was like in the mid 1990s, the first time you had to sit in on a hearing as a part of the TRC. What was that like? Because my understanding in South Africa, part of that was each of you traveled around to different communities and you listened to people's stories, either of a perpetrator or a victim, and sat and listened. And in listening, some of the reconciliation was just in the sitting with.
You may it's indeed so. It was sometimes we had to sit in on the hearing. They always had the typical hearing would be in a hall, a school hall or a municipal hall, or in a church, and the victims would come in with their family members and the general public. On the podium would be a table where the chairperson, often it was Desmond Tutu himself, with others sat. No, let me start. It was harrowing to sit at the hearings, to hear the painful stories, and often to realize that it was my people that was responsible for them. They had all sorts of arguments why they did this and that and the other thing, but it was primarily white Afrikaans people, my congregants, my people who were responsible for trying to uphold apartheid. And very often people said, all of us said, actually, well, this is horrible, this all these stories, but we didn't know about it. We really didn't know, which is only half the truth. We should have known, we could have known if we took trouble really to investigate. So I felt very, very guilty many times. But then often during a hearing, there were instances of reconciliation, of forgiveness, which was wonderful. Tutu often said that it's God is the God of surprises, who very often surprise us with the wonderful things that happen, who people can forgive, how people can reconcile, and how people can reach out to one another in the new life. It didn't always happen because you can't organize reconciliation. There's no recipe for reconciliation that is foolproof. You can bring people together. You can help ask them to tell their stories, and sometimes the spirit moves, and people really come to the point where they reconcile. Which makes me think of something I wanted to tell you. I think on your visit to South Africa, you met Father Michael Lapsley. My Father Lapsley is in Cape Town. He's running an institute, the Institute for the Healing of Memories. He was the last victim of apartheid. Even after Mandela and the others were liberated, he was the chaplain of the ANC. He was still in Harare, in Zimbabwe, and out of pure spite, the security police sent him a letter bomb to his office in Harare. And when he opened the bomb, it was hid in a Christian magazine. When he opened the magazine, the bomb exploded. He was nearly killed. He spent almost a year in hospital, but eventually he was pulled through. He lost an eye. He had lacerations all over his body. He lost both of his arms and his hearing in one ear. But he returned, and as the wounded healer, he started with his Institute for Healing of Memories, helping people during the TRC process and afterwards to come to grips with their trauma. He has a very special program which he may introduce, because he says, here I am, look at me. These are my wounds. I recognize your wounds. Let us talk about it. Mm. Interesting thing is that I just, in preparing for this, I got a letter from Michael Lapsley. I'm on his board. From time to time, he sends letters, and he says, interesting thing is how during the lockdown, people are reaching out to the Institute for Healing of Memories and say to us, can you help us? We are being traumatized by the coronavirus thing. We don't know how to handle it. Where families are, our marriages are under stress. What do we do? And he said the interesting thing is, just last week, he was invited via Zoom to run a trauma counseling workshop in the United States for people who say this trauma counseling, this corona thing is becoming too heavy for us. We can't handle it. Please help us to work through this trauma in the United States.
I mean, you talk of Michael Lapsley and kind of dealing with the trauma, and in some ways, part of that journey is trying to figure out how do we, at least from my perspective, how do we find little glimpses of hope when we're feeling the weight and the heaviness of either the fear or the loss or the hurt. In your case, for 3 years, you sat in the hurt and the heaviness of the pain in South Africa. What was it? How did you, as that group, those members of the TRC, who coached you or who mentored you through finding hope in that? How did you're carrying the weight of these stories, and especially for you as an Afrikaner, as a white Dutch Reformed minister, you're carrying that even to a greater degree in some ways. Who and how did you find that glimmer of hope? Like, how did you find that hope in that? Like, where did you, was it Tutu? Was it a counselor? Was it Mandela? Was it what? Yeah. Was it yourself? Was it with God? Yeah, I'm curious.
Very interesting question. About 6 weeks into the life of the TRC, we suffered with that very same problem, that the commissioners and the people who were sitting in at the hearings said to one another, we cannot cope. We cannot sleep at night because from a Monday to a Thursday, we listen, and the things keep turning in our heads at night. What do we do? Tutu said to us, I'll tell you what you can do. Some of the commissioners said, we need a trauma counselor to come and help us. We need a specialist to be with us and to have meetings with us and to guide us through the whole process. Otherwise, we won't be able to cope. Tutu said, yes, of course, you can have that. But I have 2 things that you need to do before that. Typically, Tutu. He said, make sure of it that you keep very close to God. Because also for you, this is a journey of faith that you cannot walk alone. And he said, please, please, please make sure of your own personal relationship with God. And then he said, keep close to your families. During weekends, go back to your families. Spend time with your spouses and with your kids, because your families will keep you sane. And then you can have the trauma counselor. They invited a very, very able specialist from London, who was a born South African, to come with us, to Lani Grenville Gray. And he, for the duration of the TRC, he conducted sessions in Pretoria, in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, where the different offices were. So he did that. The interesting thing is that when the people around the TRC heard about that, they said, please, can we be part of it? The journalists who were ascribed by the different media, the newspapers and television and radio, who went with us week after week after week, from hearing to hearing, they later became almost part of the family. They said, we need these sessions, because they said to us, you members of the TRC, you conduct the hearings, but at 5 o'clock in the evening, you go back to the hotel where you're lodging. And at night, you can have a nice dinner and drink a glass of wine with one another. You can relax. We cannot. When the hearing is finished, we need to go to our room and make a summary of the day and record it for the radio, record it for the television, and we cannot cope. The real heroes of the TRC process in this instance were the translators. You remember that at every hearing, they had a number of booths with translators, because the law said, the act said quite correctly, that anybody should be allowed to talk in his own language. So some prefer to speak in Afrikaans or in one of the African languages, and they needed translations to be done simultaneously. The best translation service came from the University of Bloemfontein, who had a department of translation services. They trained students to be very able translators, and they said they volunteered to come with the TRC, which was wonderful, but they were young people. And you can just imagine young people sitting, having to translate all the stories, all the pain. One night on the 8 o'clock news, when the TRC program, which was daily shown on television, when they had a hearing, very, very knowledgeable, the man who had the TV camera panned away from the lady who was testifying to a slip of a girl, a young girl sitting behind the glass translating. But while she was translating, the tears were dripping down her face, because she was not only translating the words, she was translating the emotions of the victims. And they, of course, also needed this sort of psychological help that all of us got. So it was a big thing, but we needed help.
So for a time like this, it's a reminder to connect. How are we continuing to connect to God, and what does it look like to connect to people?
Did that happen in the Canadian process as well? I was so interested in the Canadian TRC, where the churches were also involved in a very direct way, not only as people guiding the process, but being seen as perpetrators for the Canadian residential school system. Was that your experience as well, that the churches had a role to play?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of learning within the Canadian context. I think we're still just barely getting started. I mean, we've gone through the process a few years ago of listening and hearing stories, and there's documents out that we can look at and we can read, and powerful stories, and stories that are heavy and hard to hear. But how that translates, and I think you can speak to this, how that translates into how we actually interact and live out our daily lives. I think we're still trying to figure out, how do we do that well? How do you move from a place where, I mean, I'm a part of the settler community, people who came and took from, and although I myself was not a part of that, or don't believe to be, just by being Caucasian, being of European descent, there is a connection to the trauma that comes with that. And so what are the things that I can do and continue to do? And I think those are questions we're continuing to ask, especially as Canadians. And how do we do that well? We have an indigenous community that lives right nearby here. And I think we're still trying to figure out, how do we reconcile those communities, and how do we figure out how to do life together in a way that everybody feels seen, feels heard, and feels like they can kind of live their best.
I have so high regard for Judge Murray Sinclair and his colleagues in what they did. I was and still am very interested in the Canadian process, and it was good to try and to keep abreast of what's happening. And the final report was heartening. All the different, what did they call it, the calls to action in the different categories that needed to be.
How many were there? I should know that now. I've read, I can't remember exactly.
And the subsection on the reconciliation, with all the different points that need attention. I thought that was great. I'll be very interested to hear how the churches are responding, and how the churches are committing themselves. I read the article just a while ago. I had to evaluate the article written by somebody from the Mennonite community in Canada. And it was wonderful to see how the Mennonite community is struggling with the whole problem of guilt and of reconciliation, and how to address the problems. I am very interested whether the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church and the other churches whether they've already made not only proper statements, but have started with proper actions. Our problem, in a sense, with our TRC was that to get the whole community to buy into the process. And I was wondering whether you succeeded in that, with that in Canada, that the community at large saw the TRC process as necessary, as something that should be done and that they could maybe contribute to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for every other church denomination or community. I think it's been a slow journey to a full acceptance and a full understanding of what and how moving forward looks. I really think currently our church, for example, is exploring, it's called Circles of Reconciliation, where it brings together leaders from our Indigenous community, leaders from settler community, in our context, especially our church, and we sit and we share stories. And right now there's a group, I'm not a part of it at the moment, but that's one of the ways. And so similar to your experience, there's so much power in listening and just understanding each other's journey.
Absolutely.
And I think we still have a long way to go. As you might say, I mean, like you said, you're a quarter of a century past when apartheid ended, and there's still so much to learn and do and grow. Yes. I would argue, I mean, we still have so much to learn and do and grow and figure out how we can be and how can we be together in a way that makes everyone feel understood and heard.
What you say about storytelling is absolutely to the point. I came to realize that most of us are unable to do big things. We can't change the structures of society. We're not in a position to do all the big things. We can leave that to the politicians, the people in power. But there are things that we can do for reconciliation, for hope. And one of the simple things that is powerful is telling stories. Telling stories. I've come to realize that in a community, the biggest favor you can do to somebody is just to sit and listen and listen and listen and invite the person to talk and really listen with empathy and with sympathy, to be really involved in the story. In our country, I think one of the worst things was that apartheid worked so well, that for so many decades we were really divided into different communities, black and white and colored, and we knew so little of one another. Life went on in the different communities, and we didn't think it was important to take note of one another. But I've come to the point where I saw that if you can bring a few mothers, white and black and brown mothers, rich and poor mothers together, just having a cup of tea, starting to share stories, their concern about their children, about education. When they start telling stories, they open up. And that is the beginning. That's the beginning of the process of reconciliation. But of course, it's much easier to tell your story than to listen to the story of somebody else. I think that's something that we had to learn, that the Lord provided us for our work with 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that we need to use it in that proportion. But to really listen and listen and listen and put yourself in the shoes of somebody else is important. I think that's what I try to tell to my people, that you can't do many things, but you can really go and listen to your colleague at work, invite him for a barbecue, go make friends of a family, and listen to their stories. And then usually from listening, all things evolve that can be done, things that are important, because it comes from a real encounter.
I remember, I mean, along those lines, this idea of being seen. I think as someone sits with you and listens intently, there's this feeling of I am known. And when I am known, I feel comfortable, or I feel more at peace. a story that has sat with me that you've shared, and I would love it if you'd be willing to share, is the one of Nelson Mandela and the gardeners.
Oh yes, oh yes.
And there is some, I mean, I want to let you share it, but there is so much power, and to me that exemplifies something you've talked about about Mr. Mandela and his ability to make sure that everyone was seen. He may not have done everything right, but he could make people feel seen. And I would love it if you'd be willing to share that story. I think that's a powerful story.
Let me tell you the story.
Power and very little power.
Mr. Mandela was he was the godfather of the TRC. It was his dream, and he was very involved in the selection of people, the appointment of people, as I told you. And he came very often, came to TRC hearings, sometimes announced, sometimes quite unannounced, to hear what's going on, to identify with the process. From time to time, he invited us to talk. One glorious day, he invited all of us to his home, the president's house in Pretoria, where on the veranda, on the outside, we had lunch together. And during the lunch, somebody made a comment of how beautiful the garden was. He said, Madiba, as we call Mandela, Madiba, sure, the garden is beautiful. And Mandela said, yes, isn't beautiful. It's really nice. But let me tell you something about the garden. And then came the story. He told us how one day, I think it was a week after his inauguration, that he was driven by his chauffeur from the Union buildings where his offices were to State House. And when just the gates opened for the car to pass, and before it stopped, Mr. Mandela said he thought he saw movement in the garden, but then it was away and he didn't make anything of it. But the second day, he saw movement again. And he said to the driver, did you see that? And the driver said, yes, sir, but you're not supposed to see it. He said, what is that? He said, it's one of the gardeners, but they are supposed to hide behind the bushes and stuff, because their responsibility is to look after the garden and to tend the lawn and the bushes and the flowers. But when visitors come, they must disappear behind the bushes, because they're not supposed to be seen. They're not part of the scenery. And of course, Mr. Mandela said, that is wrong. That's not how it should happen. And the third day, he got out of the car very quickly when he saw movement. And the gardener was absolutely frightened, and he ran away. And Mandela, with his long legs, went after him. And he stopped him, and the man was shaking with fear. And he said, oh sir, please forgive me. I know I'm not supposed to be seen. I was a bit slow. I promise you, I'll dive away before nobody will see me again. Mandela said, no man, I'm not here to scold you. I'm here just to say to you, thank you. Your garden is beautiful. And he put his hand and he said, beautiful, beautiful garden. Thank you for looking after it so wonderfully. And then Mandela went into the house, State House, and he called the Major Domo. And he said to him, how many gardens are there working in the garden? And the man said, why are you asking? He said, no, how many people are here? He said, well, I think 12, about 12. He said, I would like you. I saw one of them. And the Major Domo was also appalled. He said, oh, I'm so sorry. It shouldn't happen. They have strict instructions not to be seen. Who's the man? Do you have his name? I'll sort him out. Mr. Mandela said, no, man, that's not why I'm asking you. Next Thursday afternoon, I'm free from the office. I want you to invite all the gardeners into State House. Will you please have tea ready for us? I would like to thank them. And the Major Domo said, sir, I'm so sorry, it can't happen. He said, why? He said, no gardener sets his foot in this house. That's the rule. Mandela said, no, but let's change the rule. I want the gardeners here on Thursday afternoon. And the Major Domo said, I'm sorry, sir, it's against all protocol. Never ever has a gardener been allowed in the house, and it won't happen. And Mandela said, I got a little angry. And I said to the man, need I to remind you who I am? I'm the president of South Africa, and I order you now that on Thursday afternoon, you will have all the gardeners in State House, and you will prepare a party for us, which happened. Thursday afternoon, Mandela came back from the office, and there awaiting him were all the gardeners in their Sunday best, a little embarrassed, not knowing what's going to happen now. But of course, he helped them to relax, and he spent time with them. They had tea and cookies, and they had a wonderful time. And he made a little speech telling them how beautiful the garden was. And then he said, but do you really know how beautiful your garden really is? Have you seen how your garden looks like, what your garden looks like? Let me show you. Come with me. And he took all the gardeners outside to the lawn, and there was a helicopter waiting for them. And he invited everybody into the helicopter, and then up they went into the air, and from high above they could look at the garden, how beautiful the garden was. He said, now look there, fellows, isn't this beautiful? This is what you are making. Thank you for that.
What a powerful, that has always stuck with me. And I think the question, maybe not all of us can take people to the State House and show them their work in a helicopter.
No.
But what does it look like? I mean, how can you make someone feel seen? What's your experience of helping someone feel heard and seen in moments?
Well, you don't have to look far. If you in the context where you are at work, at university, at school, in a family, in a gathering. My mother always said to me, she taught us kids, when you're in a meeting, or especially in a social gathering, just look around the room. When you see somebody sitting all on its own, her own or his own, go and sit next to him and start talking to them. The people out there, there are always lonesome people in any community. Just look for them. Go and sit next to them. I think it applies to campus life. It applies to wherever you are. There are people who are desperately wanting to be recognized and acknowledged. Go and find them and just reach out to them and go and sit with them.
Wow. Piet, I would love to talk for hours. We could talk for many more hours, but time doesn't allow it for today. I have maybe two questions that I think maybe wrap it up. The first one is, Piet, when you think of what you want people to remember Piet Meiring as, or how you want people to remember you, how do you want people to think of Piet when they think of Piet Meiring? What do you want that memory to be?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I think maybe people will think he was a very lucky guy to be invited to be part of a process. It was not his making, and it could have been anybody else. But he was so lucky that at a certain stage, people said, okay, you can come along for the ride. And it changed my life a lot. So I think if people think of me, they will say, well, he was a lucky guy.
Fun. I like that. And what advice would you give to, whether it be high school students sitting at home wishing they could be with their friends, or a congregant member wishing they could be at church, or just a community member wishing they could have a barbecue with someone? How would you encourage them to find hope in this season that feels so uncertain and sometimes a little scary?
I would say to them, pick up your telephone and phone somebody, or pick up your group on your cell phone, and just make time to phone somebody. We started to do that in our congregation. We have many old people who are, of course, very frightened and very alone. And we said, we call it in Afrikaans, bel 'n pel, ring a friend, ring a bell. And the older people so much enjoy that. Just once a week or so to receive a call from an elder or a fellow congregant, just saying, "Oh, we remember you, think of you, how are you?" It's as simple as that.
Mm.
Well, of course, I thought that you were going to ask me something spiritual. I had one text ready.
Yes, please do. Please do. My apologies.
If you wanted, if you said to me, I told you about Tutu's beautiful sermon at the start of our interview. If you said to me, now I need a sermon, I thought I would say, where is that? Oh, Romans 15, verse 13. I would say to me, this is what I would like to say to our people, and maybe to your people as well. Romans 15, verse 13, the prayer. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. Isn't that a beautiful verse?
I love that. That is perfect. What a perfect way. I think that's a great way to leave us. And I think there are so many ways. Yeah. I just really appreciate your words.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Zach. And I really hope that, thanks for bringing your students to South Africa from time to time. I wish we could reverse the process at some stage.
I wish I could come back. Oh, man. Yeah, we miss it there. There's so much learning we can do together. And so
yeah,
now,
I think
we live with Zoom, and we allow this to be our way of being together. Hopefully we can.
Thank you so much to you and to Zach for putting it all together. Thanks so much.
Thank you for your willingness. We really appreciate it. I mean, I think I only scratched the surface with you. I think there's so much more we could have dug into. I think there's so much that just for, whether it be for a church, whether it be for our students, whether it be just for anyone listening, I think there's so much that they can take from this that is a reminder of, one, connect yourself with God, connect to your personal faith. Where is that? And two, connect to the people around you. And three, a reminder, it's going to be okay. We will get through this. We will. And so I think those are powerful reminders for us.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thanks so much.
Thanks for watching today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. We're going to have weekly episodes every Monday night at 7 p.m. Central Time. We'll be releasing a new episode. If you like the video, hit subscribe. Feel free to comment if you have something to say. We'd love to hear from you. If you have a story of hope that you think would be worth sharing, let us know. Our email is in our About section on our YouTube channel. We'll see you next week.